History of the early Roman army, from 753 to 146 BC. Rome was the supreme carnivore of the ancient world. However, it should be noted that this intriguing process of conquering, plundering and ultimately supremacy wasn't achieved in a day. Rather, historians believe that the scope entailed a continuing trend of evolution and reforms, throughout the centuries, that transformed the Roman army into a veritable killing machine. While it may come as a surprise to many, but the Roman army equipment's archaeological evidence ranges far back to even 9th century BC, mostly from the warrior tombs on the Capitoline Hill. As for the literary evidence, they mention how the earliest Roman armies were recruited from the three main tribes of Rome. This shouldn't come as too much of a shock, since the settlement of Rome itself started out as a backwater that was inhabited by cattle rustlers who made their camps and rudimentary dwellings among the hills and the swamplands. The so-called early Roman society also mirrored this tribal arrangement, with its composition of the three main tribes and 30 curiae. The very word curia is etymologically derived from coviria, and its meaning basically entailed a band of armed warriors. These curiae also became the republican backbone of the emerging Roman kingdom, as is evident from their voting rights in the earliest Roman assembly, known as comitia curiata. And as for their societal ambit, each curia was composed of 10 families, gentes, and 10 such curiae formed the tribe, tribus. The transition of the Roman army from tribal warriors to citizen militia was achieved in part due to the Roman society and its intrinsic representation, with voting rights, in the Roman assembly. To that end, the early Romans were almost entirely dependent on their citizen militia for the protection and extension of the burgeoning factions' borders. These militiamen were simply raised as a levy or legio, which in turn gives way to the term legion. In essence, the so-called legions of early Rome were poor predecessors to the uniformly equipped and disciplined soldiers of the later centuries. In fact, the legions of early Rome were conscripted only as part-time soldiers and had their main occupation as farmers and herders. This stringent economic system prevented them from taking part in extended campaigns that hardly went beyond a month, thus keeping military actions short and decisive. Moreover, these legions had to pay for their own arms and armaments, which at times was compensated only by a small payment from the state. In other words, the early legions of the Roman army were expected to take part in battles to safeguard their own interests and lands, as opposed to viewing the military as a well-paying career. The popular notion of the Roman army fighting in maniples is a correct one if only perceived during the later years after the 4th century BC. However, in the preceding centuries, the Roman military system was inspired by its more advanced neighbor and enemy, the Etruscans. In fact, the hoplite tactics of mass formation of men fighting with their shield and spear were already adopted by the Greeks by 675 BC and reached the Italy-based Etruscans by early 7th century BC. The Romans, in turn, were influenced by their Etruscan foes, and thus managed to adopt many of the rigid Greek-inspired formations along with arms. Many ancient authors conformed to this Roman army adoption of foreign tactics. For example, Diodorus Siculus, in his The Library of History, mentions how the Romans ditched their light rectangular shields and endorsed the heavier bronze shields of the Etruscans. This military replication, in turn, allowed the Romans to triumph over the Etruscans. Anon, in his Ineditum Vaticanum, also mirrors this view by saying how the Etruscans were given a taste of their own medicine and the Roman army adopted the very same tight hoplite formations to counter its enemies. As per historical tradition, the very adoption of the hoplite tactics was fueled by the sweeping military reforms undertaken by the penultimate Roman ruler Servius Tullius, who probably reigned in 6th century BC. He made a departure from the tribal institutions of curia and gentes, and instead divided the military based on the individual soldier's possession of a property. In that regard, the Roman army and its mirroring peacetime society were segregated into classes. According to Livy, there were 6 such classes, all based on their possession of wealth, that was defined by asses or small copper coins. The first 3 classes fought as the traditional hoplites, armed with spears and shields, although the armaments were, possibly, reduced based on their economic statuses. The 4th class was only armed with spears and javelins, while the 5th class was scantily armed with slings. Finally, the 6th, and poorest, class was totally exempt from military service. This system once again alludes to how the early Roman army was formed on truly nationalistic values. Simply put, these men left their homes and went to war to protect, or increase, their own lands and wealth, as opposed to opting for just a career. The greatest strength of the Roman army had always been its adaptability and sense of evolution. Like we mentioned before, how the early Romans from their kingdom era adopted the hoplite tactics of their foes and defeated them in turn. However, by the time of the First Samnite War, in around 343 BC, the Roman army seemed to have endorsed newer formations that were more flexible in nature. This change in battlefield stratagem was probably in response to the Samnite armies, and as a result, the maniple formations came into existence, instead of the earlier rigid phalanx. The very term manipulus means a handful, and thus its early standard pertained to a pole with a handful of hay placed around it. According to most literary pieces of evidence, the Roman army was now divided up into 3 separate battle lines, with the first line comprising the young hastati in 10 maniples, each of 120 men, the second line comprising the hardened principes in 10 maniples, and the third and last line consisting of the veteran triarii in 10 maniples, who probably fought as heavy hoplites, but their maniples had only 60 men. Additionally, these battle lines were also possibly screened by the light-armed velites, who mostly belonged to the poorer class of Roman civilians. According to Polybius, every Roman soldier carried 2 types of pila into the battlefield, with one being thick and another being thin. Archaeological pieces of evidence, mainly from the site of the Roman siege of Numantia, in Spain, conform to this assessment. To that end, both types of the pila were made from around 1.4 meters, 4.6 feet long wooden shafts, and these shafts, in turn, were connected to narrow soft iron shanks through pyramid-shaped points. However, the thin variety differed in the sense that it had its shank socketed, while the thicker variety had a flat and wide iron piece riveted to a fatter section of the wood. Anyhow, beyond their shape and thickness, the pilum was engineered as a potent javelin-like throwing weapon that would mostly only favor the Romans. How so? Well, the design in itself was furnished so that it carried most of the weight behind the aforementioned pyramid point. This endowed the weapon with incredible penetrating power that could go through enemy shields and even injure the shield bearer. And then came the ingenious part. Once the pilum got stuck into the shield, it became very difficult to remove the pointed javelin, mostly due to its varying cross-sectional thickness. This forced the enemy to let go of his shield during the thick of battle. Moreover, the narrow-shanked varieties would twist upon impact, thus making them useless for the enemy, in case they wanted to throw these pila back towards the advancing Roman army.